Good evening to Professor Shlomo Hassan in Jerusalem, and good day to all our participants in Canada, across the land, coast to coast. My name is Dina Wachtel, and on behalf of my co-host Ayala Davis and all our colleagues at Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, it is our pleasure to welcome you all to this presentation, discussing our future worlds, possible scenarios for post-COVID-19 era. Our presenter will talk for just over half an hour, and then we will open it to questions and answers. Please feel free to send us your questions in the Q&A box, or you can wave your hand through clicking on that digital hand at the bottom of your screen, and our panelists will see your names. And then you need to unmute yourself manually. Our intention is to conclude the meeting within an hour. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Shlomo Hassan is Professor Emeritus at Hebrew University, where he teaches and carries out his research. For 40 years, he taught in the Department of Geography, the Institute of Urban and Regional Studies, and the School of Public Policy. He holds the Leon Safdie Chair at the Institute of Urban and Regional Studies and serves as the head of Hebrew University's Shasha Center for Strategic Studies. His main fields of interest are geopolitics and the global and regional levels, urban and regional planning, innovation, science and technology, human capital and the role of higher education, democracy and governance and strategic thinking. Professor Hassan, who works as a consultant to several government offices and municipalities, has published more than 30 books and monographs and more than 100 articles. Professor Shlomo Hassan, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be here this evening and to share with you some of our work about the future worlds that may confront us in the near future. This is a work that has been carried out at the Shasha Center over the last month, and we have already presented it in several forums, including the Israeli National Economic Council and some other governments, including the Defense Ministry and other ministries. And what I would like to do this evening is to share with you some of our work that has been done at the Shasha Center for Strategic Studies. Well, as you know, we live in uncertain times. We have so many questions about the future. How long will the disease last? What would be its impact on our social life? How would it affect our economic, political, and geopolitical life? And in order to deal with these questions, we use what we call a scenarios-based strategic planning. What is a scenarios-based strategic planning? In essence, we deal here with four major questions. The first question is, what kind of vision we anticipate? What kind of vision we would like to create? This is the desirable future. And it's very important to develop such a vision for everybody, for the government, for the business, and even for us, you know, as people, as members of a family, to have a vision for our family. But once we have a vision, we have to look around us and to see where reality is leading us. And then we have to look for scenarios, the possible futures. So usually we have a vision, the desirable future, and then the possible future. And obviously, there is a gap between the possible futures and the desirable future. And in order to bridge the gap between the possible futures and the desirable one, we have to look for strategies, to develop strategies, which are right here at the center. The strategies are a kind of a vehicle that takes us from the scenarios to the vision. And obviously, the development of the strategies depends on our capacities, on our set of values, on our resources, on the fields in which we excel. In my presentation today, I'm going to limit myself, because I have only half an hour, maybe a little bit more, I'm going to limit myself to the scenarios, to the possible futures. And I would like to explain what possible futures really mean. When we plan for the future, usually we use forecasting. We look at some certain factors that we familiar with, that have a high level of certainty. Let's talk, for example, about demography. And we say, well, right now, the world population is 7.6 billion people. In, let's say, 20, 30 years, it will be 9 billion, and plus minus 10%. So this is a factor that we can forecast. But sometimes there are issues that we cannot forecast. For example, the policy of the government, the behavior of society. And here we deal with certain and uncertain factors. Demography would be part of it, but we have many other issues that are surrounded by high level of uncertainty. And here we have to reverse to the planning of scenarios and to prepare ourselves for different futures. And what I would like to do this evening is to talk about the possible worlds, the possible futures, not the desirable one, not the strategies, but the possible futures. And the first question I would like to ask is, what will our possible worlds look like? And then second question, what are the signals for these worlds? So it's not sufficient to talk about the possible worlds. At the same time, we have to identify the signals that either support or contradict these words. So I'm going to talk about these two issues, the possible words and the signals that may corroborate or contradict the possible words. And when we look at the uncertainties that surround us today, there are so many uncertainties, but I think that the most important ones that we have to consider are the competency of the government and the competency of the health and technology system. So these are the two major questions that I'm going to confront in this presentation. How competent is the government? And how competent are the systems of health and technology? Obviously, there are many other uncertainties, but in my view, these are currently the two most important game changers that will shape our future worlds. And I'm looking at the two of them, and through them, I would like to analyze the rest. So if we take these two uncertainties and look at the intersection between them, let's have a look at this diagram. We have the government competency as the vertical axis, and we have the health and technological competency at the horizontal axis, and the intersection between the two creates four scenarios. The first scenario is the V scenario. The V scenario is gradual recovery, return to routine. Why do I call it V? Because there is a sharp decline, as you can see here, and we sink to the bottom, but very swiftly we manage to get out of this recession and to get back to routine, to get back to normal. So this is the gradual recovery. The second scenario is the U scenario, which is a global slowdown and the emergence of a new world. Why do we call it the U scenario? Because there is a decline here, as you can see, but then when we get to the bottom, there isn't quick recovery, like in the case of the V scenario. We may stay at the bottom for a long time. And much depends on the depth of the U and the length between the two pillars of the U. Some may say that we may stay there for half a year, maybe a year, and even more. So this would lead us to a global slowdown and to the emergence of a new world. The third scenario is the L scenario. The L scenario is long recession and systems collapse, which means that we are sinking quickly to the bottom, and then, unfortunately, we are going to stay at the bottom for a long time. So this is why it has an L shape. And finally, the W scenario, I call it brutal recovery, autocracy, and anarchy. We move down, stay at the bottom, and after a while, people realize, well, we cannot stay there for long, we must go back to work. So we climb up, but then we are reinfected and going down again and going up. And there is this process here of going down and going out, and it may take a long time to get out of this W. Actually, we may encounter several Ws. And what I would like to do in the rest of my presentation is to discuss the four scenarios in much more details and to provide some signals that support the emergence of each scenario. So let's start with the gradual recovery and return to routine. This is the V scenario. in that case, what we have is a situation where some states like China and East Asian countries managed to flatten the mobility curve, and they've already done it. If you look at the situation in China, and if we believe, and this is a great if we believe the data, then they managed to get out. And the Chinese system is returning to economic functioning already in the second quarter of 2020. But the supply chain, which means, you know, the connection with customers, with people that supply the parts that they need, the supply chain remain damaged. So this is a recovery, but it is only a gradual recovery. And we know very well that the economy of China is going to contract by about 6 to 7%. On the other hand, we have the inefficient Western governments. Mobility is rising, and you see all around us. We see it in Europe, we see it in the United States, mobility is rising. And the Western economic system is experiencing a serious blow. We have widespread unemployment, and you see it all around you. We see a shrinking consumption, and we see a reduction in business investment. And obviously, we see the decline of the GDP almost in every country. In that case, which is the V scenario, we hope that the vaccine will be developed in September, and the crisis will last until the fourth quarter of 2020. Why do I say September? Because usually the official statement is that we will have a vaccine between 12 to 18 months. But from Oxford, from Israel, from the Louis Pasteur Institute, from Paris, there are coming some signals that say that maybe it will be much quicker, and we may have it in September. And then if we manage to get out in September or the last quarter of 2020, the question is, what's going to happen to our world? What will be the impact of this disease on our world? In this scenario, the impact was very, very light. It was a sort of a timeout, okay? And then we return to business as usual. So all the previous trends may stay with us. They might be accelerated, but we stay with the same trend. What does it mean? That we have a rising great power competition, the trade war that we saw before the crisis between China and the United States is going to continue. Protectionism will be with us. Nationalism will be with us. The rise of populist leaders will be with us. And yet we'll see the rise of China as a superpower that challenge the hegemony of the United States. And we'll have a sort of a conflict between the two. It's not a new Cold War, but it's a competition and rivalry between the superpowers. And Russia may join China, and Iran may be at the Chinese-Russian front. And the conflict in the Middle East and North Africa will continue. Iran will aspire for hegemony in the Middle East. And we'll have the same protest against autocratic leaders in the Middle East. And Israel and the Palestinians will still be engaged in an endless war. And the international institutions will prove themselves, as they did right now, very weak and inefficient. And the Western government will remain inefficient, and we are not prepared for the second crisis. So this is the meaning of, you know, of sort of a timeout and gradual recovery. We are out of the crisis, but nothing, you know, fundamental will change in this scenario. Some support for this scenario. When we look at the curves that describe the spread of the disease, we can see that China, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan managed to flatten the curve, and you can see it right here. But when you look at Italy, when we look at Iran, when we look at the United States, when we look at Germany, we see steep curve. And I took these curves from the New York Times. It was published in March. And at that time, I asked myself whether China is going to be the leader because they managed to flatten the curve. And I don't know the answer to this, but you can see the differences between China and East Asia on the one hand, and Europe and the United States on the other. And this is another diagram that shows the differences in death cases per million in OECD country. It's almost historical. It's the April 6th, which is 11 days ago, and which is a long time when you have such a disease. And you can see the leading countries in the world were Italy and Spain, and Belgium was not far beyond. Look at Canada. It was only about 5 cases per million, 5 deaths per million. But now I'm moving to yesterday, April 18th. And here you can see what happened in the meantime. You can see that Spain and Italy are still leading, but that time it's not 250, but about 400 cases of death per million, 400 cases of death per million. The United States is 130. China is about 3 per million, 3 per million. You ask yourself, where is Canada? Canada and in Israel, which are right here, Canada has 40 death cases per million, Israel 20. Look at the United States, it's 130 cases per million. But look at this exception, which is, Southeast Asia. And you have here Singapore, and you have here East Asia, Japan, and you have here South Korea, rich countries with a small number of death cases per million, which shows that, the Asian countries have a sense of preparedness. They were quite prepared for this disease, while other countries, the Western countries, were not well prepared, which is part of the scenario. Another thing that we can learn from this diagram is the correlation between affluence and the severity of the disease. The richer the country, the higher is the number of death cases per million. Well, it might be an outcome of globalization, because the affluent countries are more exposed to globalization. But there might be another explanation. The countries here at the bottom, most of them are African countries, are just experiencing the disease, and maybe in the next few months, we will see a steep curve of growth in these countries. So we have to follow the signals and to see what happened here. And when we look at the strategies that were devised to deal with this issue, one of the well-known strategies is the hammer and the dance, which was suggested in March. And it says that if you do nothing, you'll have an exponential growth. If you try to mitigate, just warn people, it won't have a much effect. But if you have isolation and border restriction and wearing masks and have social distance, use the hammer, then you can flatten the morbidity curve without even having a vaccine or medication. And then there is a dance. It goes up and down, but we stay here at the bottom. And this is what we have seen in many countries, especially in East Asia. And this is what we are seeing right now all over the world. All over the world, we can see that governments, although quite late, have taken the appropriate measures. And we can see that the spread of the disease is not exponential anymore. The red line represents the exponential growth. The blue line represents the flattening of the curve. And you can see that at the worldwide, we can see the flattening of the curve. And different countries like Italy on the one hand and Sweden on the other, we can see the flattening of the curve, which is an indication that maybe the V scenario, which is, gradual recovery, will hold, and very soon we will recover from this epidemic. So this is one scenario, the V scenario of gradual recovery. The second scenario is the global slowdown. The global slowdown is the scenario of U. What we have here is the emergence of a new world. There is no vaccine until December 2020. Until 2020, we'll see all around us high morbidity. We'll see economic slowdown in 2020, and the recovery will be only in the second quarter of 2021. What we see around us is reactive governments. The governments, especially in the West, are reacting to the disease, but they are not prepared like the East Asian countries. So they come up with stimulus plans, that deal with the jobs and business and the citizens, and they've already invested $10.6 trillion in a stimulus plan, which is equivalent of 8 Marshall Plans. And the business ethics is changing from shareholder that account only for the people who hold the shares to stakeholder value that they account also for society. Technology enables us remote learning, remote working, remote e-commerce, remote shopping, remote services. It affects our social contacts, and it creates a new kind of consumerism behavior, which has to do with recycling and circular economy, because people really realize they don't have to go to the restaurants anymore. They can prepare their meals by themselves. What a surprise. And we have a communal support and local sense of solidarity. People help each other. And we have the return to distance. Several years ago, we declared that distance is dead, but now we return to distance. We have border restrictions. We have less globalization. We have short supply chains, and we have less physical contact that affect every aspect of our life. And obviously, it has to do with shrinking globalization. We will travel less. We are not traveling at all right now. We will have less accommodation, less hotels, less restaurants, less everything. And we need improved geopolitical relations. And the Secretary General of the United Nations already declared on a universal ceasefire. And we see that some countries are following this decision, like Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or Israel and the Palestinians. And the West reinvents itself. We have liberal tradition, we have new technologies, we have new ideas, we have efficient and modern governments, and maybe there will be a regime change in some countries. And unlike the first scenario, the B scenario that puts China at the center, we may have the West here, maybe the United States at the center, if this scenario works. What are the indications for this scenario? First of all, if we look at the supply chains at the global level and the local level, we can see that government, business, and householders are in big trouble. Business is not working anymore. So they have to lay off their labor. And obviously, if they lay off their labor, households do not have enough resources to consume. So we'll have, this effect on business. Then at the world level, we don't have customers to export to. So the supply chain at the global level is broken. And the only thing we can do with this is by having government intervention in needed area, the areas marked by X. So this means that we are going back to big government. For many years, we talked about lean government, okay? We talked about the efficiency of the market. But now we are going back to the efficiency of governments. And when we get out of this crisis, the governments will still be in charge of many aspects of our life. So I'm not talking about social welfare. I'm not talking about welfare society, but I'm talking about safety nets. We are talking about governments that are involved in all kinds of incentives to improve our life. And this is what we see right now when we look at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the International Labor Standards. They are talking about the new pillars of our economy, stimulated the economy with active fiscal policy. We are talking about supporting enterprises, jobs, all of that is associated with the government. We are talking about protecting workers in the workplace. And we are talking an ongoing social dialogue for solution between government, business, and civil society. This is something which is unheard of. We never heard the government, we never heard international institutions talking this way. And when we look at the past and we try to learn from previous epidemics, and I won't go into through all these experiences, we can see that the smallpox disease between 165 and 180 AD led to the rise of Christianity and the collapse of the Roman Empire. And the Black Plague in Europe in the years 1347 to 1351 put an end to the Middle Ages and led to the Renaissance. And we have clear conclusions for this, that plagues, diseases are quite often associated with a potential for far-reaching political and economic and social changes and scientific changes. And there are always ways to deal with epidemics by science, medicine, and so forth and so on. So hopefully we'll put an end to the coronavirus and there will be a radical change in our society. So this is the kind of lesson that we have from the global slowdown. The third scenario is the long recessions, which is associated with system collapse. This is the L scenario. What do we have here? No vaccine and no cure for a long time. It may take 12 to 18 months, which is the standard. And then the health care system is overwhelmed, unable to confront the epidemic. We have deep economic slump and governments are helpless. We have political crisis, legitimacy crisis, economic crisis, growing inequality. We already see it around us. Look at the situation in the United States and look at the situation of the Hispanic community and the Black community. We have social isolation, little cooperation, suspicion and fear from public gathering. There is extreme individualism associated with this scenario. And the world is closing in. It is becoming more selfish. States are looking after themselves with little international cooperation. And in this case, we have a chaos. We have geopolitical rivalries that intensify. We have international institutions that are weak. Hamas will attack Israel, demanding, some favors from Qatar and Israel and Turkey. So all around us, we are going to have a long chaos. And what are the indications for such a scenario? This is a projection published by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, last week. And look at the title. The Great Lockdown, the world economy will experience the worst recession since the Great Depression. I want to remind you, the Great Depression between 1929 to 1933. And we are in the same situation right now. According to this projection, the global GDP is going to shrink by 3%. In the global financial crisis of 2009, it shrank by less than 1%. Now it's 3%. And look at the situation here, how it's going to affect the United States, a decline of 6%. Europe will be 7%. The only exception here will be China and India. And when you compare it to the financial crisis, you can see the difference, the financial crisis of 2009. So we are facing a totally different situation, economic situation. And when we look at a recent scientific article published by Harvard Business School last week in Science, it says to avoid this prolonged and intermittent social distancing may be necessary into 2022. So it's not a V scenario. It's a long-term recession that may last until 2022 and even until 2024. And the last one is brutal recovery. This is the scenario of autocracy and anarchy, the W scenario. What do we have here? We have a vaccine within 2 years. In the meantime, trial and error. Okay, we go back to work, and if we are reinfected, we will go back to a lockdown. We have gradual lifting of restrictions through differentiation, segmentation by social, geographic, and age groups with testing, a lot of testing and tracing. In Israel, for example, today, some people are allowed to go back to work, 30%, but they say the elderly should stay home. Considerable degree of surveillance and social control to curb infection. Authoritarian regimes supported by multinational corporations that trace infected persons, and Google and Apple already mentioned that they are going to install some application that can trace our movement. Inequality and exclusion of non-essential workers and the elderly. Growing resentment, we see it in the United States now. People take out to the streets and demonstrate against the government. We have a resentment which regards privacy, freedom, and return to work, legitimacy crisis, protest and anarchy. And obviously there will be some senior people like Henry Kissinger that would say that life comes before freedom, and we'll have suppression and very shaky authoritarian regimes. So what do we have here that supports and corroborates this scenario? First of all, we have this famous curve that shows that medical containment make the medical crisis less bad, okay? You can see we flatten the curve, the blue line, but make the economic crisis worse. So if we let people go and work, it will be this curve with lots of people being sick, but the recession will be low. If we flatten the recession, we'll have this depth of recession. And the strategy that is recommended here is a sort of an exit, but through W. We have full lockdown here, which depends on the carrying capacity of the intensive care units. So here is the safety buffer. We should not go beyond it. So there is an ease, we lift the restrictions, and we go out, and there is reinfection, so we go down. And then we go out, we get to this place, and we go down. So it's trial and error because we don't have a vaccine. And when we think about the exit strategy that many countries are taking this day, it's the W scenario. What are the health and social and political implications of such a scenario? I would like you to think about it. Do we have sensors to detect the return of epidemic spread? Do we have enough testing for it? What is the alternative? Waiting for vaccination? So this is a sort of an assessment by the Tony Blair Institute, and they look at the different strategies. Scenario 1 is lockdown until vaccine, and scenario 6 is contact tracing and testing, and this is the W case. And obviously, they recommend the 6, which is contact tracing and testing. So yes, there will be death, but the economic contraction wouldn't be so high. It won't be 30%, it would be 12%, 15%. And when we listen to Henry Kissinger, he says, and I'm quoting for an article that was published in the Wall Street Journal on April 3rd, this millennial issue of legitimacy cannot be settled simultaneously with the effort to overcome the COVID-19 plague. Priority must be established. So what are the priorities? Order over legitimacy, which is now life before democracy. Maybe he is right. Maybe many people will support this kind of a scenario. So to end up, I would like to say that we are living in mixed worlds. Some of us will recover swiftly, they will become immune, they will become symptomatic, and they will go back to work. Some of us will participate in brutal recovery, maybe get reinfected, go back to home, stay there, and get back to work. Others, especially the elderly, might witness long recession. The outcome is probably more likely to be a mix, many threats and lots of opportunities. And under these conditions, we have to be optimistic. We have to develop the courage that we need in order to look at the opportunities looming in this crisis and to avoid the threats. And I think that when we look at these different scenarios, and obviously I didn't talk about the vision today. I talked only about different scenarios. I talked only about possible worlds. There are many, many threats that we are going to encounter, but there are also many, many opportunities, like the opportunities of creating solidarity, becoming more efficient, preparing ourselves for the next crisis. We can even learn from the L scenario with the crisis, the collapse of the system, because we can learn from it in a negative way. What we should avoid. We should avoid this rivalry. We should avoid the possibility of transcending the carrying capacity of the health system. We should learn from it that we should strengthen our health system. So there is a lot of opportunities that can be taken from the different scenarios. And by the way, what we are doing right now in the Shasha Center, we are looking not at the threats, but rather on the opportunities. And we ask ourselves, what are the opportunities open to us through this crisis? For example, remote learning. What can we learn from it? We know the teacher take the remote learning as if it's the old method, and instead of coming to the class and standing in front of the class and giving a lecture, they give it in a remote way. This is not the right way to work. We can think about hybrid classes. We can think about, relying on people from other universities that may come to the class and address the students. And I have in mind, people who live in peripheral areas that might be exposed to the best teachers in the world. Why not doing it this way? So there are many opportunities that loom in this crisis, and we must take the courage in order to maximize them. And I would like to end up by raising several issues for your consideration. First of all, the first issue is crisis management. When you look at the different scenarios, when you look at your government, what can you say about the way the crisis was managed, especially by countries in the West and countries in the East? Does the crisis management show us that perhaps meritocracy is much better in times of crisis than democracy? When we look at the issue of democracy, freedom and health, do we have really this set of priorities that say first health and then freedom? And if we have to restrict your freedom, yes, we are allowed to do it. And how long it's going to stay with us if we restrict your freedom today? Are we going to remove these measures in the future? And about geopolitics, what's going to happen in the future? Are we bound to get back to the old geopolitics of rivalry and conflict? Or maybe there is an opportunity here for cooperation, and this leads us to globalization in the economy. We know that globalization is essential, but right now globalization is shrinking, the economy is shrinking, and I read what the top economists are writing today, and they say we have to diversify our supply chains and maybe to create local supply chains. Is this really the case? What about relative advantage? What about commerce? And we have learned from many years, 1,000 years, that we need this principle of relative advantage, and we need diversified supply chain. Are we going to restrict them now? And what will be with our social life? We are accustomed to cities in which we have density, in which we have physical contact, in which we have heterogeneity. And right now, we are going back to our castles and to our fortress and to our suburbs. And what will happen to the city? What's going to happen to High Street, for example? What's going to happen to the restaurants, to the bars, to the cafes? Are we going to change and become more individualistic or more communal? I leave it at this point, and I'm very much interested and appreciate your view on this.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Shlomo, for a most interesting presentation. Each and every one of the quarters of the 4 issues that you mentioned could serve as a course at the university, and you had a challenge to summarize everything into a 40 minutes presentation. So now you're all invited to ask your questions, and we will start with Lorraine Martin. Would you please unmute your mic? Lorraine.
Yes.
Lorraine?
Yes, I have a question. I was wondering if you see the future of the present medical health situation reverting to alternatives and prevention rather than the medical model, and for encouraging people to take ownership of their own health by looking at alternatives. So that's my question.
Very good. I suggest that we take several questions and then I respond. Is that okay?
Yes, I see that Ronen Tana has a question. Ronen, go ahead. Please unmute yourself.
I don't hear him.
Ronen? I will read the question that Ronen submitted. It is clear now that the lockdown of most economies and putting people in self-quarantine at home have flattened the curves in most countries. Could you further explain how flattening the curve could imply, that the V shape might actually work? As yet, the only proof for controlling the virus is via isolation and prevention of mass gathering. We have a question from Jane Sheeper. Jane Sheeper, do you want to unmute yourself? I will ask the question for Jane. How do you view Israel's view of recovery versus that of the view of Canada? I would also like to ask, to add a question. Does the manner of crisis management give advantage to autocratic regimes and reveal the weaknesses of democracy?
Yeah, very good question.
Let's take it from here, Shlomo.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that Lori raised a very interesting questions about, alternatives that have to do with prevention. And I think this is the real challenge, because right now, and I talk to people, I talked to the dean of the Faculty of Medicine in Hadassah, and I asked her the same question. I asked her, now that we develop, what we call personal medicine, okay? Why do we have to wait for the patients to come to the hospital? Why don't we reach out for the healthy people, check them, and see what's going to happen and prevent the disease? And I think you're absolutely right. And when I called her and I said, this is something that should be taken by the hospitals. Instead of hospitals for the ill persons, it would be the hospitals that host the healthy person. She said, okay, I agree with you, but it requires a dramatic change in our curriculum, because we have to train the future doctors to master the arts of computers, to be in a position to examine not only the genome of the people, but the impact of the environment. And I think this is the right way to go right now to have this prevention. But I would like to connect your question with the current situation. I think that if we learn something from this crisis, that is that we need what we call telemedicine. We need remote medicine. We need the medicine that can trace the ill patients and come up with the required remedies for this. And obviously we don't have it. It's not well developed right now. They do have it in Singapore, and they manage very well in treating their patients. For example, they have the community services in the neighborhoods, in the different neighborhoods, so they don't have to come to a central hospital. They have the services in the neighborhoods. They have the community hospitals, and we need to develop it. This is one lesson that we have to learn from this crisis. Now, Ronen talked about the issue of flattening the curve and isolation. And Ronen, you're absolutely right. I think this is the right way to go. Imagine, just imagine, that when we had the first information about the people in China, the whole world would say, for 3 days, 4 days, 10 days, okay, we are going to put everybody on isolation. And after a while, okay, we discover the ill patients, we treat them, and it's over. This is the right way to go. So I think that because we didn't have it, and we didn't have central institutions, and we didn't have a society that is willing to follow the rules, we pay heavily for that. And one example that I can talk about is the example of the ultra-Orthodox people in Israel, especially in the cities of Bnei Brak and Jerusalem. Everybody was warned. Everybody was asked to stay at home, to be in isolation. But they are an exception. They would go to the synagogues and infect each other, and then we are with it. So it's not only the government that have to make a decision. It's also the norms and the rules that the public is following. And then Jane asked a question about, the recovery, Israel and Canada. I think that Israel and Canada relatively are doing very well. Canada has, as I've shown you, only 40 death cases per million, Israel 20 per million. And I think that in Canada, we have, a huge country, and you have a lot of space. This is not the case of Israel. We live in a very dense society. But still, the government is going with some instructions. And I think that the Canadian spirit, maybe I'm wrong on that, the Israeli spirit, at least until now, was to follow the rules. Most of the people in Israel follow the rules. And for this reason, we have seen a decline at the number of infected people, of seriously ill people in Israel. And hopefully this will be the case also in Canada. And about your questions, the autocracy and democracy, Well, this is a very serious question because when we look around us and we see who is successful right now, we see that Singapore is successful, and Singapore is not a democracy. Singapore it's a meritocracy, and China is a dictatorship, and they are very successful. And then people may ask themselves after the crisis, why do we have to support democratic regimes if they are so inefficient? Hopefully, we learn something from them and prepare ourselves. I personally believe that we should refrain from extreme cases and look at the capacities of liberal regimes. When I look at Germany, for example, when I look at the example of South Korea and even Japan, these are democracies and they are doing fine. So yes, you're right in your question, Dina, that autocratic regimes prove themselves very efficient, but in what price? And we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to pay this price? And this question becomes very relevant when we move to the W-shaped scenario, because in my view, until we find the medicine, we are going to live with sort of authoritarian regime. I'm talking about Israel. I'm talking about the United States. There will be a lot of testing and tracing and tracking down people that have been infected. And you know, we are in a state of war. In a state of war, we suspend some of our human rights. Mm-hmm. But obviously, hopefully, it will be for a short time.
We'll take a couple of more questions, Shlomo. Several of the participants today are asking if you can give your thoughts as to the approach taken by Sweden to COVID-19.
Yes.
David Berger is asking, he's saying, writing, unfortunately and tragically, mostly it is older people in Canada in public and private residences who have died. Is the same around the world. How does this affect your scenarios? Can we get, and then he's asking for a copy of the presentation, which we will make available.
Yeah. Very good questions. Okay, Sweden. I must admit that I myself is following, you know, with a lot of interest the Swedish case, because unlike other countries, unlike other northern countries in Scandinavia, like Norway or Denmark, Sweden embarked on a very interesting experience. They would not ask the people to lock down. They would let them, okay, there are some facilities that have been locked down, but they would let the people go to school and to the kindergartens and to the park and to the jobs. And what is the result? What is the result? We have to ask ourselves, how successful is Sweden? And I'm following the data. And what I've seen, that over the last week, the average number of death cases in Sweden was 60 to 70. Yesterday, it was 154. So, which means that Sweden is not that successful. And I'm worried that if this trend continues, it would be 200 and 250, and then they will have to ask ourselves, are we going on with this policy, which is very close to the immunity of the herd, or are we going to reverse our policy and to move to isolation, like the question that Ronen and others asked, and to have lockdown? I don't know. I think that Sweden is in the middle of an experience, but as far as my intuition tells me, I think that they are going to reverse the trend because the price will become very, very heavy for Sweden. And they will have to reconsider the policy. So far for Sweden. Now about the elderly. You're absolutely right. A large percentage of the people who died in this crisis are old people. Just to give you an example, in Israel, out of the people that have been infected, only 19%, only 19% are people at the ages 60 and over. But this group forms 79% of the death cases, almost 80%. And most of the people who died in Israel, about 40%, are from nursing home. And this is the situation all over the world. You may remember the nursing home in Seattle or Washington, okay? It started in a nursing home. And this group is the most vulnerable group. And we have to devise new ways to deal with them. We cannot let them die in their nursing home. We need a special policy. We learn something. Maybe they have to be dispersed. Maybe they have to be sent to other places, but we cannot group them in one place and get them infect each other and die. And unfortunately, this was the case until now. My advice to people who are not in nursing home, but are in the ages of 60 and over, don't be tempted to lift the restrictions and to go out right now when we get into the W scenario. Many people are moving out, but you're a vulnerable group. So my advice is this: stay at home for at least 2 weeks and see if the epidemics is returning, okay? So this is the case for Jerusalem. In Israel today, the government has decided to lift some of the restrictions. And my advice to my friends, don't go back to work, don't go back to school, don't go back to the university, stay where you are and wait for at least 2 weeks and see what happens. And if we have a second wave, you are not there, okay? And this is not something that I recommend to the government, I recommend it to civil society. By the way, many of the recommendations that I am making today are not designated for the government, they are designated for us, for civic society.
Thank you very much, Shlomo. Before we end, one more question, since you are, one of your expertise is the Arab-Israeli conflict. Raquel Hirsch is asking if you can comment on the collaboration between Israel and Gaza and the Palestinian Authority and the implications of it.
This is a fascinating issue. We can spend a whole evening on this issue because for many years I thought that the only way to bring the two parties together is to confront a third enemy, another enemy. Until November, I thought that it would be climate change. I went to Sweden with a group of Palestinians, okay, people who participated in the Madrid conference and the Annapolis conference, and we discussed the future. And I said to them, maybe we need a third group that would be the enemy, and then we unite forces. I didn't anticipate the coming of the corona. But now when the corona came, we can see that the two parties cooperate and work together. The Israeli government is working with the Palestinian Authority, and the Israeli government is now supporting the administration in Gaza. And we send them ventilators, we send them masks, we send them equipment. Why? Because first of all, this is a humanitarian issue, and we have to confront it. My recommendation was also to support Iran. And second, this is an opportunity. If we seize upon this opportunity, okay, and build some bridges between Palestinians and Israelis, we may be in a better position. And this is why I do not believe that we are returning so quickly to the V scenario. I still believe that the U scenario has some chances. And if we manage to have this cooperation, maybe we can confront other problems in the future, because my reading of the situation right now is that the coronavirus is just an introduction to the coming real crisis, which is climate change. And climate change is going to affect everybody. But obviously, we are short-sighted. We deal only with the coronavirus, and we don't see the coming threats associated with climate change.
Thank you very much, Shlomo. I can't thank you enough for making yourself available for us in Canada. It's late in Israel. You are leaving us with much, much food for thoughts. And according to the number of questions that are flying in here, we will need to do a part 2 to this. So to you in Israel, I want to say thank you again and Laila Tov, and to all our listeners across the land here in Canada, I'm wishing you a good day. Goodbye.
תודה רבה לך, תודה.